Hello, everyone. I'm Flip Pideaux. Welcome back to Old Bull TV, your insider's guide to political prediction markets. Today, we are sitting down again with Dr. Rachel Bitecofer, Senior Fellow at the Niskanen Center, who just today has released her initial forecast for 2020 House and Senate races. Dr. Bitecofer, thanks for joining. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's great to see you. As fans of the channel, likely remember we had you on with us for one of the hours of our 2020 political prediction conference just a few days ago, during which you were kind enough to preview this forecast for us. And we've been eagerly awaiting its release, and it did hit your website, briefly crashed your website early this morning. So there's obviously been a lot of interest in it. Before we get to exactly what it says, can you review, for those who may not be familiar with your work, what approach you take to modeling House and Senate forecasting, how kind of differs from the traditional election forecasters out there?
Yeah, so it's very, very different. It's not a probability model, and it doesn't have the same ingredients that the probability models have. So, and that's because it's based on kind of like a whole new theory of elections, what I call a theory for the polarized era. And it argues that, we've had this long genesis of, the political parties forming their modern coalitions. As a political scientist, I spent a long time talking and teaching students about the Southern realignment. At one time, there was this huge ruling Democratic, regime in Congress that ruled from the Great Depression until, almost 50 years, right? Mm-hmm. And it was empowered because it had an ideological coalition. It had conservatives in the South who were also segregationists, and then liberals in the North. And then as the civil rights movement finally achieved goals and got federal action through the courts and through the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts in the 60s, that coalition crumbles apart, and we have this massive transformation in the parties ideologically, where liberals become Democrats and conservatives become Republicans. And so, we are looking at historical elections where, during that metamorphosis, things were possible that aren't possible today. Number one, there were a lot more voters that could be persuadable, because I might be a conservative Democrat or a liberal Republican interested in Bill Clinton, right? Or a conservative Democrat interested in being a Reagan Democrat. But today, with much less of that going on, especially in the Republican coalition, we have a harder case to make when you're trying to appeal to opposition parties, because that ideological homogeneity is a big factor. And so the other thing that I'm arguing is that because of polarization, a lot of the things that used to be great predictors, as far as relevance to you guys on this channel in particular, a lot of the good predictors aren't so great anymore. So if you were to take an old fundamentals model and put in the economic data for what's happening now, and usually in the political science literature anyway, it is the second quarter data that is used, it is going to predict a landslide victory for Joe Biden, for the Democrats, something that would look akin to a 1980 electoral college map, because the economic data is going to be absolutely wretched. And then you have, of course, the crisis of deaths, which is a new factor we've never had. But because of polarization, I said as the pandemic began, I would be bearish that we'd see a lot of change in Trump support. And as long as 90% of Republicans stay with him, he takes some right-leaning independents who behave very similarly. He's got a pretty solid floor that will leave him competitive, even if the election is in favor of Biden, which is what my forecast at the presidential level shows. Trump is going to be competitive to win as long as he's got that Republican coalition tightly aligned behind him. And they don't seem shakeable by anything, So in the old world, they're looking at elections in a different way than I am. I'm looking at turnout, the role of turnout, what the demographic composition of an electorate looks like in districts and in states, and whether or not, when I'm looking at that historically, I'm keeping in mind that the turnout that Democrats produced in 2016, prior to 2016, was under a model of what I call, complacency, basically being in the in party, it's not that partisanship or polarization in Democrats didn't exist. It just wasn't as fervent as it is now because they're locked out of power, and it's not just locked out, but it's Trump there, which is an extra added accelerant. And so Democrats came into 2016 kind of nitpicky about their nominee and, not all that enthused to vote. And Clinton was as unpopular as Trump, whether that you think that's fair or not, it's a mathematical fact. And, under my model, I talk about, okay, now Democrats are super motivated to vote because of negative partisanship, this idea that, if I don't vote, the other party is going to have control. I'm, really stirred up by emotions of the other party, especially when they're in power and they're doing policies and Supreme Court picks and things like that to antagonize you. And so, what my model did was look at where this latent demographic surge might come out, where it could come from, headed into 2018, based on my observations and backward modeling of Virginia's 2017 elections, and isolated college education is a really big predictor. So my model looks at that and percent of non-white population and competitiveness, and those are the three variables that feed in to produce why in this case is not a probability, it's a two-party vote estimate for the Democrat.
Great. No, that's very helpful background in terms of your methodology. So, and with that in mind, and without further ado, let's get to the high level output here. What do you forecast in terms of House and Senate pickups? Sounds like you're looking for net pickups for the Democrats in both chambers. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, and you know what? To tell you the truth, I was really surprised, like pre-pandemic, how much of the conversation just went back to, well, it's going to be competitive, and how many of these seats can Democrats defend in 2020 that they picked up the 40 in 2018, and like, so let's pretend that the pandemic never happened. Like, my forecast is more aggressive because of the pandemic, certainly, but the entire tone of it would have been the same. Democrats would have come into 2020 on the offense, not on the defense. They left seats on the table in 2018 because they weren't using, and I don't think they still use, my system of identifying potential competition. They look at other things, right? So there were districts, especially in Texas, which I highlight, 8 districts in Texas in the suburbs of Dallas and Houston, and also the gerrymandered districts that all tug into parts of Austin. And they did not compete robustly for most of them in 2018. So that gives them some potential room to gain. And although I do have a couple of the 40 seats, the more reached ones like Utah 4, as competitive for Republicans in this initial rating, generally speaking, we're looking at Democrats gaining ground in the House, not looking at them losing or defending turf. And that, of course, that's now been further added on with the pandemic and the economic collapse, which is going to do Republicans no favors. And we're already seeing that in the polling data of the last couple of weeks, and the Republican Party is seeing that data too.
Right. So with as you mentioned, 40 seats they picked up in 2018, putting them at, I think, 232 currently in the House. If all of your leans or likely Democrat forecasts were to go that way, and all the lean likely Republicans go that way, where do they wind up compared to that 232 after 2020?
Well, I mean, they have a potential to gain another dozen seats, but that would be really ambitious. It's certainly not what I'm expecting. I expect they'll pick up about half of those 6 seats in the House. They've got a couple that were strategic retirement openings that I think are almost all sure bets to go. And then it's a question of how many in addition in that Texas lot can they pull off. And they've got a really nice prospect in Arizona 6 too. So that's another one. The Elise Stefanik district, New York 21, which is not on anyone else's ratings, but appears on mine, I put in because the challenger is very good. She has been running a very good campaign, and she's already raised $3 million. So I'm anticipating at least competition in New York 21. Stefanik, of course, went into Congress, had a reputation of being bipartisan, and really lost that reputation during the impeachment trial, where she kind of got on the radar, I think, of like the establishment Democrats and the Democrat voters, right? So I think 6 is probably for now like what I'm thinking it out. But again, Democrats have, and I point this out in the forecast, have to run a perfect game down there in Texas. And, the pandemic actually is not an asset to them because of the restrictions on voting down there. It's not a state that a lot of states, like the swing states for the presidential, have already legalized in their systems vote by mail. They may not use it extensively, but the infrastructure is there and it's already legal. Only New Hampshire doesn't have a vote by mail or absentee, like a no excuse absentee voting type system.
Okay.
So they just need tweaks. But Texas is a very difficult state to politically participate in. And that's why all of those districts are starting off with a lean R advantage, because Democrats have to overcome the historical lack of investment there, because they've never really competed in many of these districts before, and without competition investment performed pretty good in the two-party vote share in 2018. They do have, the Texas State House is extremely competitive too, and there's a lot of overlap for those House districts. So, like North Carolina, which we'll talk about in a second, that state legislative competition and activity is definitely going to factor in.
Interesting. So you said sort of the outside, maybe upper bound Dem pickups might be around a dozen, with more likely being perhaps closer to half that. I want to, just for benefit of our political traders out there, take a look at the current pricing on the net Democrat pickups in the House market. And this is showing that if your analysis is correct, there's some money to be made here. Because if you were to pick up 6 or more, that would be this bracket here, 238, or 238 to 241 would imply to pick up between 6 and 11. It sounds like that's sort of the bracket you're focused on. Not quite a dozen, but probably a half dozen or more. And you can get that currently for 11 cents, 11 or 12 cents. And if you wanted to pick up one of these neighboring brackets to give it a little bit of margin of error, you can get that for a combined probably in the low 20s. So depending on how risky you want to go, you could have a 5 or 10 to 1 return by November if Dr. Bitecofer's forecast is accurate here. So it seems that the center of gravity here of the conventional wisdom, at least in the markets, is that there may be Democratic pickup, but possibly more like the low single digits, or possibly even sort of a wash. But jumping very quickly, and I know you wanted to touch on a couple of the specific House districts, but to stay at the kind of high level just for the moment, can you tell us what your expectation is in terms of the net Senate pickups? Because I think you tend to be a little more Democrat friendly here, not only than the markets, but than other forecasters. So I'm interested to hear what your forecast is showing there.
Yeah, I just don't see a scenario in which Cory Gardner can hold on to the Colorado seat. I identify him as the most endangered Republican incumbent in either chamber for the 2020 cycle. The 2010 cycle or 2018 cycle was Barbara Comstock in Virginia's 10th. That was the district that I identified as the most hostile to Trump, MAGA Republican environment, and most susceptible to Democratic realignment and turnout surges that my theory and work focuses on. So Colorado to me is just, it's going to the Democrats. And then I feel pretty strongly too about Arizona at this point. Arizona is, not only showing a tendency and a proven ability to flip, but it also has Mark Kelly, so the NASA, it's got a celebrity nominee. I mean, you can't get a more quality pick for that race against McSally. And McSally is an appointed incumbent. She did run a statewide race, so she has some infrastructure and campaign experience. And she's not like Loeffner over in Georgia, where it will be a new game for her and a new system that has to be designed. So it's like, kind of washes out that aspect of the incumbency effect. But McSally has at least the infrastructure from her failed 2018 bid for the other Senate seat. And but I still think Arizona, I mean, the one thing I couldn't talk about in the forecast, because it's very long already, is that's the ground zero, like McCain Republican area there. And I suspect because Sinema, the 2018 nominee, overperformed like the normal bar of like crossover voting, which is, about 10 or less percent. She was a little bit higher than that. So she got like an additional couple points of Republican vote and I don't have any data to back this up, though I'm hoping to, fix that in the 2020 cycle. But because the polling did not include in Arizona a question about John McCain favorability. But my hypothesis is there are some McCain Republicans, especially in Arizona, and they are not pleased with Trump, with the party, and they express that through voting for Democrat. So, I think Arizona and Colorado are just, people are talking about them as toss-ups. I think by the time we get into October, it's going to be clear that those things, they're going to spend probably, but they're going to be, very clearly in Democratic favor. And Maine, I feel almost as sure about, but it's a different situation because both in Colorado and Arizona, we're talking about demographic surge and realignment, being able to really power those switches. Maine's a different story. It's not like it's got a surge population, but it's got a big chunk of independents, and they have always, favored Collins over there, Collins over there, due to her reputation of moderation. But that reputation has taken a huge hit too, with trying to stave off primary fights. Like in an ideal world, she'd have been able to do things to capture that image with her electorate. But in the Trump Republican Party, it's full allegiance always, and if you don't do it,
right,
you get hammered, right? So all of these Senate Republicans would have been better off moderating the last year and running towards the center, voting for impeachment witnesses, so on and so forth. None of them could do it because they were all facing primary challenges or the ire of Donald Trump, which is, political suicide in the more immediate way. So, they went with just try to ride it out. So those three, to me, are, very, very likely to go into Democratic hands, and that puts control of the Senate up into contention, but they're going to probably lose the Alabama Senate seat, so they're going to need another district, and they've got 6 good prospects to pursue.
Interesting. I wanted to quickly switch back over again to some of the market pricing here, because you mentioned 3 races there in Colorado, Arizona, and Maine. And I think in the market pricing, we've got Colorado in the kind of the low 80s, Arizona in the 70s, and then Maine is the one that's showing still a Democratic edge. As you said, you're almost as confident here, maybe slightly less, but still think it's likely to go Democrat. Market's showing something similar, 2-1, basically Democrat over Republican. But this, again, if your forecast is right, might be the one among the 3 which offers the biggest potential gain to traders that might want to put your forecast into practice in the market. Now, and to remind viewers of the math, as you were just alluding to, also they need a net 3 if they do capture the White House and have the tie-breaking vote. They would need 3 to go from 47 to 50. But as you said, if they lose the Alabama seat, then they need a 4th. So eager to hear. And you said, I think there's something like 6 fairly rosy prospects for that pickup. So it sounds like they might even vault well over the 50. But if there were one sort of bubble seat to give them a 51-49, or with the vice presidency, a 50-50 majority, what do you think is the most likely pickup beyond these 3?
So today I'm going with North Carolina. It's got this very vibrant, it's like the same story as Arizona, except for, different ethnicity. Arizona's political revolution is powered too by Latino mobilization as a backlash to the Sheriff Joe tyranny and to the Arizona law that they passed, the Show Me Your Papers law. In North Carolina, it's overreach by the former Republican governor, Pat McCrory, and the North Carolina Republican majority in the legislature, which have done several things that have, really galvanized and stoked the political fires in North Carolina. North Carolina, of course, is gaining population. That research triangle is becoming more politically influential in terms of the political metamorphosis that has left Virginia as a blue state. North Carolina and Georgia are in that process. So, and of course, North Carolina had a tendency, or recent, even before all of this additional decade of population change and realignment, and now energized and older millennials. Millennials were quite young in 2018 or in the 2008 cycle. Now they're balding and hitting 40, right? They, you know, that energy, if they could flip the state in 2008, suggests to me that it's a very viable target. But, you know, so of the six, that to me is the most viable one. But, you know, Kansas would become a quick second if Kobach becomes the nominee, as is increasingly looking like it might happen to them again. I mean, they've basically got a Roy Moore situation in Kansas, and Kansas has a couple competitive districts in there that where most of the state's population lies. So there's going to be other activity going on in Kansas. Kansas has a tendency, it's one of those states that can, I mean, even in the polarized era, we will see some states that are Republican pick Democratic governors. I mean, Kentucky and Louisiana right now, especially the atmosphere favors Democrats overall. So Kentucky would probably be, or I'm sorry, Kansas would probably be my second pick, assuming that Chris Kobach, or how do you not say his name, becomes the nominee.
Right. And I was just showing the market pricing as you were talking about it there. It shows just over 60% likelihood that he does capture the nomination. And this could, again, be interesting for traders in that this one is actually showing 67% chance of Republican winning in November. So this may flip significantly depending whether he does win the primary. But again, this may be an opportunity here for really an outsized gain if you think this one is going to be a Democratic flip as well. Would offer you 2-to-1 payout if that one turns out to be the case. So that's it gives us two possible ways for them to get over the hump there in Maine and in Kansas. And you mentioned there are another three or four, I guess, beyond that. So what if you had to sort of peg a most likely number in terms of where the Democrats get to? I saw that in the language on the post on your forecast suggested Democrats could have a good day, that they stand a good chance of getting to a majority, but it sounds like you could wind up with a more comfortable majority here of, say, 51, 52, even 53. What if you had to, pin the tail on the donkey with a single number? What do you think would be most likely?
Man, I think it's not a gimme that they're going to hit 50, to be honest with you, because they're Democrats and they're, they're running Democratic campaign electioneering strategies. They have all the wind at their back, but they don't have Rick Wilson running their advertising, right? Mm-hmm. If they were to, so today I'm going to say they have a really good chance of taking that majority. Okay. I'm not looking at added territory yet. I'll be looking closely at how much they understand, how they frame Trump. I mean, do they even bother to talk about him? Because in 2018, they thought it would be a bad idea to mention the deeply unpopular, vastly hated Republican incumbent president, which is, as Michael Steele and I recollect in his podcast, just baffling, right? So, mm-hmm. So much of it is variable on, this vice presidential nominee too. So like when we talk about those two Georgia Senate seats, if it's a moderate white nominee in Georgia, I don't know that the turnout's going to be good enough. Who knows? And turnout was so clear before the pandemic. I mean, I talked quite a bit about voting infrastructure, and another reason why those Texas seats are not going to be easy to flip is because of voting infrastructure. In the pandemic is, Republicans have been pretty not coy, I think, about seeing reduced voter turnout as a mechanism of perhaps holding off this wave. And, my forecasted model was initially built on a 70% turnout rate in 2020, so yeah. And like, we're just not knowing, like, is there going to be a wave of this pandemic happening in November, right? Mm-hmm. We can see what happened in that one Wisconsin contest. We do have some primaries coming up in June. So those will be good data points to get a sense of how like voting is happening under, constrained conditions. But, though, if there's a weakness to the forecast, it's the uncertainty of voting, like the actual act of voting now that was introduced by the pandemic.
Now, if we go back to Senate control again for a moment, we talked about the three that you see as the relative layups, I guess, and they lose one seat potentially in Alabama, and so they need the one more. It sounds like there's enough good prospects that you have a relative relatively decent confidence that they get to 50. But of course, say they do get to exactly 50, that does, of course, depend then on who wins the presidency in terms of who would have the majority. As you mentioned before, you're forecasting a Biden win, but does the prospect of Biden not getting the nomination, whether or not you feel that's a legitimate risk at this point or not, take it as a given for sake of argument that he were to somehow fail to capture the nomination, and this is something that on Predicted has been creeping up in recent days as some of the Tara Reade allegations have begun to gain traction. So he's now showing about a 21% chance of not actually capturing the nomination. Does your model take into account that kind of sort of a seismic shift, or can you sort of qualitatively get your arms around what might happen were there to be a shakeup like that, or is that sort of too hard to fit into the model as structured?
I just have a hard time believing that we're going to see not a Biden nomination. I mean, I think here's the thing with the Tara Reade allegations, which were vetted by the New York Times and every other major media outlet out there trying to find collaboration, and they failed to do so. And they all, I mean, one thing people should understand about the media is that they are going to follow their own self-interest, and their self-interest was breaking the story, not covering it up. So, having every major media outlet vet it, and then suddenly, HuffPost uncover Business Insider, and HuffPost uncover some new person that can validate in a way that the newspapers couldn't, just leaves me a little bit skeptical that, in the mainstream, people are gonna accept that allegation against Biden. You never know, right? But again, that vetting by the major media outlets and the failure for them to produce collaboration really, I think, is it's going to take more. It's going to take another individual who had experienced behavior like that to derail the nomination.
And so let's go back to sort of the standard case. Assume Biden is the nominee and Biden does prevail in November. Do you have a sense of what the likely electoral college vote margin might be? Are we looking at a landslide, or sort of, a Trump qualified landslide, a real historic landslide, more of a squeaker? Because again, this is something that we can gain insights into in terms of the conventional wisdom, again, by looking at the market prices, and we see it's really pretty scattered. There's no consensus yet in terms of where it might wind up, but from that we can perhaps read into the mindset of the market that they're not expecting an outsized victory by either side. Does your model zero in on a particular range or number that the margin is likely to come in at?
So my model goes pretty intensively into coding things. It doesn't leave, I mean, I try not to leave too many toss-up races, but there are a couple. But right now, with the things that I've kind of compartmentalized away for the Democrats, I think they're at 289, and that leaves Iowa and Florida and North Carolina uncoded, I believe. So, I mean, here's the thing, Democrats are going to win the Senate. They're going to be winning the presidency with it. Those things are going to go together, or they're not, going to happen at all. And it's just very difficult to imagine a scenario in which Republicans are going to be emboldened in the state of North Carolina. Florida, the Democratic Party there's like my model actually insists that Florida should be getting carried by Democrats, right? And the reason it hasn't been is that the Republican Party, the state party there, runs a very good electioneering system, and the Democratic Party doesn't, and it underutilizes a lot of the potential vote from surge voters that it could have been focusing on GOTV resources, right? And before the pandemic, I was expecting a very robust investment in GOTV, because that state party is starting to figure out, that they're underperforming their potential, right? But how do you GOTV if in a pandemic? I mean, are there going to be rallies? Old people are increasingly the country's response it seems to be leaning towards, well, old people stay locked in your houses and we'll kill off a certain portion of you so we can reopen society. I don't know how they're going to respond to that, in terms of like their voting behavior. Again, like the only data figure I care about is the party split on Trump approval. And until and unless you see Republicans going below 90% in approval, then I would say, Florida is still a very good state for Trump because of the median age being so high there, and the Republican Party's apparatus being good. But like I said, the Democrats are definitely investing there. They definitely are changing, their, traditional methodologies. And they did the same thing in this Wisconsin State Supreme Court race, and you saw the fruit that it bore. So, it's, I guess that's all I'm willing to say about my toss-up state, Florida.
Sure. And what's so interesting about your model is that it allows drilling down really in a detailed way at the district level, the House district level, and looking at the demographics and employing your turnout assumptions and what that implies for the vote share and some of these potential party flips in these seats. What are some other, we talked specifically about a handful of the Senate seats. What are a couple other of the House seats that your approach, that your forecast shows a likely result that really differs from what the conventional wisdom is seeing? I noticed in the table, and I'm going to put up a link to your model too, where people can see race by race all of your projections and how they compare to other popular forecasters. And I saw several of them that were somewhat stark differences, where people had toss up, and you had likely Democrat, for instance. What can you highlight a couple of those where your model is seeing something that the traditional ones are not?
I mean, there's less of those this cycle, like the really different ones, right? In 2018, I mean, that was easy. And as I explained in the post, I was able to come in, like the initial rating on the day it released, like today, like all those California Orange County districts were coded as competitive toss-ups, lean R, maybe lean D by everybody else. And I was able to come in, throw down and be like, no, all of these 100% flipping, okay? Mm-hmm. And I talk about why I was able to do that. It's a story of the college education partisan competition score, the PVI, and the demographics, but it's also the voting infrastructure that was put into place, and the organization that happened in California, which had its own political metamorphosis. I mean, California used to be a two-party competition state, right? It's not now, and it's not an accident. It's the way that the Republicans used power in the state when they had it, and then when they lost it, Democrats were not dumb, and they expanded access to voting. So the infrastructure was there to allow the kind of turnout surge that I expected to see. In these Texas districts, a lot of them are not, they don't have that benefit of a nice voting infrastructure. It's going to be hostile, so on top of all those other things you have to get over, incumbency and traditional investment and convincing the party that it's a worthy race and so on and so forth. You also have to overcome this voting infrastructure that's very hostile. But yeah, I mean, when I put this out, I guess I felt like it was pretty modest compared. I think the California districts, like, they think Democrats will need to defend, and I think, well, yes, I mean, they're going to need to spend and defend them, but at the end of the day, these California Orange County districts are not flipping in 20. They'll probably all be competitive in 2022 if Joe Biden is the president, most of them anyway, right? And then, so I guess, my rating differs a lot there. I already talked about New York 21, which was a lot different. But, I would say that, a lot of the handicappers have been pretty bullish on their ratings. I mean, Florida 26 and 27, I'm not really any different. They're willing to say likely, and I'm willing to say those are staying in Democratic hands. It looks like the Georgia districts I'm a little bit more bullish on. They have them as tossing up. I just don't know how you can have two open Senate races down there. Potentially, an attractive VP pick and Abrams, maybe Harris, and not have those two seats given their demographic makeup and the fact that Woodall in the 7th strategically retired because he expected to lose the seat in 2020. I mean, you have to keep in mind 2018, as good as it was for Democrats, that is a midterm cycle. The electorate becomes more Democratic in presidential years overall. And, we're going to be looking at no matter who they pick, even if they pick Klobuchar, even though I say that, a woman of color would massage turnout further, like, there will be a turnout surge of all elements of the Democratic coalition, from white to Latino to young to women to college educated people to African Americans or Black voters. Okay. The size of that that stimulus can be massaged, but there will be a basic turnout increase. And the demographics in those two Georgia seats are just so hot to trot with that open retirement from Woodall too. I mean, the seventh would not be, it would be a toss up if it was not for Woodall strategically vacating it. But let's see. Yeah, whenever a Senate incumbent or a House incumbent, decides not to run for re-election in a competitive seat,
Right.
that's a buy that day.
Yep.
Free tip. Not that I don't do this, and I don't have a moral objection to it or anything. It's just that I am a huge college football fan, and go Ducks, go Oregon Ducks, and I am convinced that if I bet on the things I care about, that it will, it will. I'm a very unlucky individual, so I do not.
Karma will punish your picks if you
yes.
put your money behind them.
Can't bet on college football, and I can't bet on elections.
Right. I saw anecdotally, at least, sort of looking through your list, and again, sort of scanning for where you diverge from the other forecasters, and in your table you compare to Cook, Crystal Ball, Inside Elections. It seems, again, this is anecdotal, but sort of caught my eye was that a handful of freshman Democrat incumbents that the conventional wisdom seems to suggest are vulnerable, you don't seem to see as being as vulnerable, that they're either leans likely or even solid Democrat. I noticed in Michigan 8, Representative Slotkin, California 21, TJ Cox. Is there something systematic about your approach that is finding less freshman incumbent vulnerability or less Democrat incumbent vulnerability generally than the others?
Well, I mean, keep in mind the only seat that the Republican Party gained, I think they gained one or two, were both realigning towards the right, because what's powering all of this at the end of the day are these regional realignments with the metro and suburban areas moving to the left and the rural exurban areas right. And there are a lot of there were strongholds in the Northeast that were based on union, like white working class union power for the party. I mean, that's why when you look at like election returns from Missouri to now, and in Virginia, like Warner's a great example of this. So like when somebody else had posted up the map for Warner's election, his initial election to the Senate in Virginia, where his, got a ton of support in Northern Virginia and the southwestern part of the state, and, showed, how over time that changed. And in 2020, like his winning, he's going to win the state handily, but he's going to win it almost like a completely inverse regional map, right? It's going to all be on the eastern side of the state, and he's going to kill it over there, right? So, when I looked at in 2018, there were a couple of districts that still hadn't been claimed by Republicans, that were in Democratic hands, that were going the other way. And I spotted those by looking for places that overperformed, where Trump overperformed Romney. And you could see that pretty easily in the data, which ones are moving left, which ones are moving right from that. But again, college education and demographics are the main things that I'm estimating. Right. So my assumption is, I think Democrats are going to make electoral campaign reforms. They already have. It already has impacted the race in Wisconsin, under the excellent party chair that they had in that state. And I think that will encourage them to do more of that electioneering stuff in other races. So I think, like, we've been seeing kind of what they can do with a subpar, like a strategic approach, like an outdated strategic approach. And now that they're making modifications on it, I expect they're going to do better. But, all of these districts in 2022 that are, woohoo, safe today, they're going to be competitive in a different environment.
Fascinating. Well, what I love about your approach and your model is that while it's different, and part of what I love about it is the fact that it is different, you take sort of a bold, still data-driven, very quantitative approach, but a very different sort of philosophy to understanding those data and how they translate to predictable outcomes in these very diverse set of political contests, but that you not only have a different approach, but that you're willing to back it up by saying, and here's where I plant my flag. And I plant my flag very, very early. You planted it in July in 2018, and it was dismissed, not surprisingly, by many of the incumbent traditional forecasters as simply being wrong. But of course, it was well validated, not only as being accurate, but as being earlier than all of them. And of course, you've now come out, it's only April. We're still more than 6 months from Election Day. And as you said, it's not a probabilistic forecast. You have maybe one or two toss-ups, but other than that, you're saying this is how I think each of these races are going to go. And here's my scorecard by which to grade me after the fact. So we'll see. Best of luck to you. Thank you so much for sharing some insights and helping us to understand the sort of thinking that goes into the underpinning of these forecasts and highlighting some of these interesting races. It's been a real pleasure spending some more time with you. Best of luck to you. I want to let all our viewers know that if they want to go in and dig into this model, read your very lengthy write-up, very thoughtful, lengthy write-up, which is worth the time of reading. I promise you. You can go to Niskanen Center, which is Niskanen center.org, and you will find it there. And is there anything else you want to add, Dr. Bitecofer, for our viewers in terms of where they can follow along with your work or generally keep up with what you're doing?
Definitely recommend they follow me on Twitter. I'm pretty active there all day.
And that's at Rachel Bitecofer. Is that right?
Yeah, nobody wants that name, so it was available, at Rachel Bitecofer. That's Bitecofer. And, I'll just close off by saying there's two of the most outdated adages in politics. One is all politics is local. That's bullshit, okay? It's all now national. But the second one is, well, there's a lot of time between now and Election Day, okay? Because that's what the Bitecofer methodology is basically arguing, is that, the fundamentals are pretty set in stone long before, and it's because of polarization.
Very interesting. And that really is your electoral theory in a nutshell. And I guess it's what enables you to come out with these quantitative forecasts so much earlier than everyone else. We'll certainly be keeping an eye on it. I hope and I expect that traders will be referencing this to guide some of their investing activities. And we hope to see you again back soon on the channel. It's a real pleasure to talk with you, Dr. Bitecofer. Stay well. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me.